So our next speaker is Fred Jennings, and I want to tell you a little bit about Fred. We spoke about fish yesterday with Scott Dowd, and Fred is also a fishy person. He is an angler, and you're a fly fisherman, is that right? So I understand that fly fishermen, when you do that, you use very tiny hooks when you fish for flies.
Usually.
When you fish for flies. That was a bad joke. I'm sorry. Fred has also been on the conference planning committee, and we have talked extensively about the challenges of bringing economics into a restorative as opposed to a destructive role. And we will have other speakers talking about that as well. I used to be allergic to economics, and I have in the past few years realized that we're not going to do this until we get all the resources we can possibly muster on board. And as you can see, once again, multitasking is not a strong point, at least not for this human, and I suspect not for many others. In any case, here's Fred.
Thank you, Adam. Can you hear me? All right. My talk is called The Role of Economics in Ecosystemic Conservation. And my talk has two basic parts. First, I'll address the question of why nature is absent from traditional standard economics. And second, I'll consider some ways that nature can be incorporated into economics, both theoretically and in practice, and why that's of critical importance. But first, I want to make some prefatory remarks to contextualize much of what I will say. First of all, the value and purpose of theory is to guide our real-world decisions. Every decision we make is based on imagined projections of outcomes, and those imagined projections of outcomes are based on theory. The belief is that if I kick the world in this way, this will happen. And those if-then statements comprise beliefs of how the world works, on which we base our actions. The assumptions behind a theory are the if statements, which define and thus confine the realm of its reliable applicability. If those if statements, those assumptions, fail to correspond to real-world conditions, then the then conclusions derived from and thus standing on those premises will not be reliable guides to action. I ask you to keep that in mind as we compare two conflicting economic paradigms. But I want to make one more point from my own personal experience, because in my early economic education, it always struck me as strange and quite discomforting that the assumptions that were being made in the theories I was being taught were not accurate representations of real-world conditions. Rather, these assumptions were being made because they were required to make the mathematical model work, and that they allowed the model to close to an equilibrium state. And interestingly, that is a required condition for scientific acceptability in mainstream economics. Any model has to satisfy an existence proof that it will turn out to lead to an equilibrium outcome. Now, in that context, I want to look at two economic paradigms But I want to start with the question of why traditional economics ignores natural processes. Nature is not present in economics. Economics stays on the blackboard. So we're going to look at two economic paradigms: traditional mainstream standard economics and ecological economics. And basically, to give a sort of crude summary of the two approaches, traditional economics is presented in mathematical terms in the form of equations showing a balance of opposing forces, such as supply and demand, leading to an equilibrium based on incentives for personal gain and their wider social implications. And specific situations are modeled without reference to other situations or anything else, as if all cases were separate and independent. Ecological economics, in contrast, takes an ecological view that everything is connected, and that the analysis of any one situation cannot be conducted without reference to other surrounding circumstances and spreading effects. So ecological economics takes a holistic systems approach, and with a recognition of the evolving complexity of all economic events. So now let's look at specific aspects of that. For a worldview, basically, standard economics sees stable equilibria unconnected to each other, whereas ecological economics really looks at the whole system as an open, evolving, adaptive, complex system. In terms of analytical style and method, standard economics uses precise models based on deductive logic derived through an axiomatic approach, and while ecological economics really works from inductive inference based on experience and looking for regularities that produce complex structures in a systems approach. The rationality assumptions are very interesting in the two, because in the standard approach, basically the assumption of perfect knowledge or complete information are made, and the consequences are bounded, so you can take parts of the analysis and just do them on their own. Whereas ecological economics sees consequences as limitless, that everything we do ripples outward forever on everything and everyone, and that it is our awareness of those consequences that is bounded and limited. So there's a real contrast there. In the social process part of the story, economics looks at opposition and conflict and scarcity, because it's opposing forces that you balance in an equilibrium story. And standard economics sees competition as efficient. In fact, they're almost synonymous. If it's efficient, then it must be competitive. If it's competitive, it's efficient. In ecological economics, there is far more emphasis on concord, harmony, mutual gains, and abundance, and the story is much more about cooperation. Instead of decentralization with competition, you want integration of systems with cooperation. My work over the last 20 or 30 years has been on planning horizons, and I think it's odd that the rationality assumptions in standard economics lead to a theory which is totally focused on the short run, and that basically my work concludes that competition is actually creating a myopic culture in self-destruct mode, and that's the failure of competition. Ecological economics takes a larger vision, a greater perspective, looks at foresight, and looks much more at the big picture. So you have these two opposing approaches. The general point here is that accepting full interdependence and connectivity of the entire world system forces you to deal with the limits of human awareness in what I would call a horizontal approach. Now, given full interdependence and limited awareness, we need to think about internalizing what economists call externalities. Well, they're not really external, they're just beyond our vision. We set them in motion, and what we want to do is design systems that feed them back to the decision maker, so the decision maker will incorporate those effects as much as possible in the decisions they make. So there are various approaches to that, and there are basically two general categories. One is the inculcation of conscience, ethics, and caring into human decisions. Now, this is an issue, I would say, of planning horizons and trying to encourage larger vision and greater perspectives in behavior. And I've spent 20 or 30 years on that, and I'm not going to talk about that today. But if you're interested, I'd be happy to do a workshop on some of that stuff, because it's really interesting. But instead, what I want to talk about in the rest of my talk are social incentive structures and how we can either the ones that exist already or the ones we could create to feed back consequences to decision makers so that they are more restorative and ecologically conscious. The first one, obviously, is private legal action. If the bastards pollute my river, I can sue them. Now, that's a not perfect solution because it's risky and it's costly. Another alternative would be public advocacy. I can lobby my representatives, or I can go to my local NGO, my advocacy group, and try to get them to participate in this process to fix problems. Recycling is another example, and there is a move as one part of recycling for cradle to grave, or sometimes called cradle to cradle, accountability, where particularly with heavy appliances like refrigerators or washing machines or stoves or carpets or this kind of stuff, where instead of selling the good, the manufacturer sells the services of the good in a leasing arrangement. But when, at the end of the lifetime of that good, the manufacturer takes it back. Now, what does that do? Well, it internalizes that waste, and the manufacturer immediately is going to start building these appliances so they're easily recycled, because that's more efficient. So you internalize the waste, and with the recognition that there's no way that we can throw this stuff, and so we should recycle it the way nature does in its processes. Green taxes are another example, and the basic idea of green taxes is that we ought to be taxing bads rather than goods, because then the response with tax avoidance is to reduce the bads, which is always a good thing. So if we're taxing pollution, etc., we can improve things that way. One example of green taxes is carbon emissions taxation or carbon credits, where you basically tax those on the left side who are polluting, and you use those tax revenues to subsidize restoration activities, such as on the right side of the slide. there are also all sorts of private or public-private financial systems that are being developed to encourage eco-restorative activities, some of which Daniel Robin will talk about. And there's a wide variety of them that reflect some of the work by ecological economists on the value of nature's services. And finally, I think that basically at this stage of the game, what we need is a massive federal program for eco-restoration based on something like the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, the Manhattan Project, etc. It has that kind of urgency, and it needs to be a worldwide program. And Jim Laurie mentioned that last night, and I agree with him that I think that's really where we need to go. But of course, the first step is going to be to get the leadership of this country to recognize the problem. So what have I said? Well, the first thing I've said is that we need a paradigm shift from standard economics to ecological economics. I've suggested that unrealistic assumptions are not going to be good guides to action, and a lot of my work suggests that economics has made a very profound and fundamental error in the way we have framed the whole field, and that it is bringing us to the crisis that we face now. But there are also two classes of methods to internalize externalities and help resolve some of these problems. One of them is the inculcation of ethics and conscience and larger perspectives, larger planning horizons, and the other is to design social incentive structures to encourage better activities that are more ecologically sensitive and restorative. So that's basically my talk, and Daniel Robin is now going to give you some examples of some of these methods.
In a moment.